on the morning of March 17, 1892. In the frozen hills of northern Vermont, Margaret Whitmore walked into the town constable's office carrying a wicker basket. Inside that basket were the severed fingers of her twin daughters, preserved in honey and wrapped in their baptism gowns. She confessed to everything that morning, her voice steady as stone, her eyes empty as winter sky. But the confession she gave wasn't the whole truth. What actually happened in that isolated farmhouse during the terrible winter of 1891 would take months to uncover, and when the final pieces fell into place, the people of Harwick Township would realize that some hungers run deeper than flesh, and some bonds between twins cannot be broken even by death itself. Now, let me take you back to Vermont, 1891, to a time when winter could kill you as surely as any blade, and isolation could drive the sanest mind toward unspeakable acts. The Whitmore family arrived in Harwick Township in the autumn of 1888. Robert Whitmore, a stern-faced man of 42, with the calloused hands of someone who'd known hard labor all his life, had purchased 60 acres of rocky hillside land at a price that should have warned him something was wrong. His wife, Margaret, 37, pale and thin with dark hair, always pulled severely back, rarely spoke to the neighbors when they made their infrequent trips to town. But it was the twins who drew the most attention. Clara and Caroline, 8 years old when the family arrived, identical in every physical way, pale as milk with black hair and eyes so dark they seemed to have no pupils at all, the locals whispered. Of course, in small towns whispers are the primary currency, especially about newcomers who keep to themselves. The Whitmores attended church sporadically, purchased supplies with minimal conversation, and rebuffed every attempt at neighborly friendship. The twins never played with other children. On the rare occasions when they came to town, they stood pressed together, shoulder to shoulder, holding hands, watching everything with those unsettling dark eyes, but never speaking. Not to adults, not to other children, not even, some claimed, to their own parents. The Whitmore property sat 3 miles north of town, accessible only by a rough cart path that became impossible in heavy snow. The farmhouse itself was old, built in the 1820s by a family named Schaefer, who'd abandoned it after 2 consecutive crop failures and what the historical records vaguely termed domestic troubles. Robert Whitmore seemed determined to make the farm work. Despite the poor soil and harsh climate, he planted wheat and kept chickens, a few pigs, and 2 dairy cows. Margaret kept a kitchen garden. They lived simply, some said meanly, saving every penny, eating modestly, burning minimal firewood even in the depths of winter. The twins, Clara and Caroline, were homeschooled by their mother. No one quite knew what they did all day up on that isolated hillside. The few visitors who'd made the trek to the Whitmore farm reported that the house was spotlessly clean, but strangely barren, with almost no decorations. No books visible except a Bible and a few agricultural manuals. No toys or diversions for the children. The twins, when glimpsed, were always together, always silent, always watching. One neighbor, a woman named Ruth Hastings, who'd brought a basket of preserves as a welcoming gift in 1889, later told the county investigator that she'd felt the twins staring at her the entire visit, and that, when she'd tried to speak directly to them, they'd simply smiled identical smiles and said nothing. It was like looking at dolls, Ruth had said. Beautiful dolls that someone had given eyes to, but forgot to give souls. The winter of 1890 passed without incident, or at least without any incident that reached town. The Whitmores made their usual supply runs, speaking to no one unless necessary, purchasing flour, salt, kerosene, coffee, and seeds for spring planting. The twins were now 10 years old, and if anything, had grown more unusual in their appearance and behavior. They'd become even more identical, if such a thing were possible, to the point where even their parents sometimes seemed confused about which girl was which. They dressed identically, always, moved in synchronization, and the few times anyone heard them speak, they spoke in unison, the same words, at the same moment, in the same tone. But that was only the first sign of what was growing in that isolated farmhouse. The winter of 1891 came early and came hard. The first snow fell in late October, and by mid-November, Harwick Township was locked in ice. Temperatures plummeted to 20 below zero and stayed there for weeks. The cart path to the Whitmore farm became impossible by early December. This wasn't unusual. Winter isolation was a fact of life in northern Vermont, and most families prepared for it, with adequate food stores and firewood. The town wouldn't expect to see the Whitmore again until March or April, when the thaw came. What happened in that farmhouse during those frozen months would only be pieced together later from Margaret Whitmore's confession, from the journal they found hidden in the cellar, and from the physical evidence that painted a picture too terrible for most people to believe. But we know it started with hunger, not the ordinary hunger of a delayed meal, but the deep, gnawing hunger of dwindling supplies, and the growing realization that winter wasn't going to release its grip anytime soon. Robert Whitmore had miscalculated, whether through poor planning, bad luck, or the simple brutality of that particular winter. The food stores he'd laid in weren't sufficient. By January, the family was rationing severely. The chickens had stopped laying in the cold. One of the cows died, and while they butchered it for meat, the beef had to be carefully preserved and stretched across months. The pigs, thin from reduced feeding, would need to last until spring. Margaret's kitchen garden was buried under 4 feet of snow and ice. The twins grew thin. Their already pale skin took on a translucent quality, blue veins visible at their temples and wrists. But they didn't complain. They never complained. They simply watched their parents with those dark, depthless eyes, and held hands and whispered to each other in voices too low to hear. Margaret wrote in her journal, which would be discovered later, that she sometimes woke in the night, convinced she could hear the twins talking in their room, having full conversations in rapid, eager voices. But whenever she crept to their door to listen, there was only silence. And when she opened the door to check on them, they were always asleep, curled together in a single bed, despite having two. Their faces peaceful, their breathing synchronized. February brought no relief. The temperature never rose above zero. The wind howled around the farmhouse like something alive and malicious. Robert tried to hunt, trudging through waist-deep snow with his rifle. But game was scarce, driven into deep shelter, or starved itself. He shot 1 rabbit in 3 weeks of trying. It made a single thin stew. The family ate it in silence, each person staring at their small bowl, as if willing it to be more. It was in late February when things changed. Robert Whitmore went out into a blizzard to check on the livestock, and didn't come back. Margaret waited 2 hours, then 3, then until dark. She couldn't search for him, not in that weather, not with the twins to care for. She kept the fire going, and waited. The twins sat together on the floor near the hearth, holding hands, rocking slightly, saying nothing. When Margaret tried to talk to them, tried to explain that their father might be in trouble, they just looked at her with those empty eyes, and smiled their identical smiles. Robert was found the next morning, or rather, Margaret found him when the storm cleared enough to venture out. He was 30 feet from the barn, frozen solid, half buried in a drift. His face was peaceful, eyes closed, as if he'd simply decided to lie down and sleep. The cold had killed him quickly, they say, merciful in its way. Margaret couldn't move him, couldn't dig a grave in the frozen earth. She covered him with snow, marked the spot with a stake, and went back inside to her daughters. Now there were 3 mouths, instead of 4, but also 1 fewer pair of hands, and the strongest pair at that. Margaret knew she couldn't manage the animals alone. She knew the food wouldn't last. She knew they were trapped until the thaw, which might not come for another 6 weeks or more. And she knew, though she wouldn't admit it to herself for several more days, that her daughters were watching her with a new kind of attention, an intensity that made her skin crawl. The twins began to change after their father's death, or perhaps Margaret simply began to notice what had always been there. They were hungry, constantly, ravenously hungry, though they ate their small portions without complaint. But Margaret would wake at night to find them standing by her bed, just standing there in their white nightgowns, staring down at her in the darkness. When she lit a lamp, they would blink as if coming out of a trance and return to their room without speaking. During the day, they followed her everywhere. Silent shadows, so close she could feel their breath on the back of her neck when she cooked or mended clothes or tried to read her Bible for comfort. And they were always whispering now, constantly whispering to each other when they thought she couldn't hear. Margaret tried to catch the words, but never could. It was like listening to water running over stones. A constant susurrus of sound that might have been language, or might have been something else entirely. She asked them what they were talking about. They smiled and said nothing. She demanded they answer her. They smiled wider and turned away hand in hand to whisper some more. The food situation became desperate. By early March they were down to dried beans, some flour, a little salt pork that had gone rancid. But Margaret cooked anyway, because what choice did she have? The pigs had been slaughtered weeks ago, the meat already consumed. The surviving cow had stopped producing milk and was too valuable to kill, being their only hope for milk production when spring came. If spring came, Margaret began to wonder if spring was real, if she dreamed it, if the world had always been this cold. Gray eternity of ice and hunger. The twins grew stranger. They stopped sleeping in their bed. Margaret would find them curled together in corners, in the cellar, once in the small space beneath the stairs, pressed together so tightly they seemed like a single creature with two heads. Their skin grew even paler, almost luminescent in the lamplight. They moved with an uncanny grace, absolutely silent, appearing and disappearing like ghosts. And they were always hungry, always. They ate their portions in seconds, scraping their bowls clean, licking their fingers, staring at Margaret's bowl with an intensity that made her lose her appetite. On March 12th, 5 days before Margaret would walk into town with that terrible basket, something happened that she would later struggle to explain coherently. She woke in the deep hours of the night to find both twins in her room again. But this time, they weren't just standing by her bed. They were kneeling beside it, leaning over her, their faces inches from hers, and they were smelling her. She could feel their breath on her face, could hear them inhaling deeply, and the sound they made, a kind of satisfied humming, raised every hair on her body. She screamed, and they jerked back, but not with surprise or fear. They looked annoyed, as if she'd interrupted something important. "Get back to your room," Margaret had gasped, pulling her blanket up like it could protect her. The twins had looked at each other, some communication passing between them that needed no words. Then one of them, Clara or Caroline. Margaret couldn't tell which spoke in a voice that didn't sound like either of them. A voice that seemed to come from somewhere deep and old. "We're so hungry, Mother." "I know, darling, I know. We all are. It's just a few more weeks until the thaw. Then we'll get help. Then we'll have food." "No," the other twin said. And now they were both smiling, and their teeth looked too sharp in the lamplight, though that had to be a trick of shadows. "We're hungry now." Margaret ordered them to their room. They went, but slowly, reluctantly, looking back at her with expressions she couldn't read. She pushed her dresser in front of her door that night and didn't sleep. Outside, the wind screamed. Inside, she could hear the twins whispering. The next day, Margaret made a decision. She would go to town. The thaw had begun, just barely, the temperature rising above freezing for a few hours each afternoon. The cart path would be impossible with mud, but she could walk it. She thought she could get to town, get help, get food, get away from whatever was happening in this house. She told the twins she was going. They looked at each other and smiled. "Don't go, Mother," they said in unison. "Stay with us. We'll take care of you." Something in the way they said it made Margaret's blood freeze. She insisted she had to go. They needed help. The twins just smiled and whispered to each other and didn't argue further. Margaret tried to sleep that night, but couldn't. She kept imagining she heard footsteps outside her door, kept imagining she could feel eyes watching her through the walls. When gray dawn finally came, she rose, exhausted and frightened, and discovered that her boots were gone. Her heavy coat was gone. The twins' coats were gone too, and their boots. And when she searched the house frantically, she couldn't find any of them. The twins sat at the kitchen table, watching her search with interested expressions, like scientists observing an experiment. When Margaret confronted them, demanded to know what they'd done with the clothes, they simply said, "We can't let you go, Mother. Not yet. We need you here." Margaret Whitmore's journal, found hidden beneath a loose board in the cellar, contained entries from those last days that were barely coherent, written in an increasingly shaky hand. She wrote that the twins had become something other than her daughters. She wrote that they moved through the house at night like hunting animals, silent and purposeful. She wrote that she'd woken on March 14th to find them standing over her bed with a kitchen knife, just holding it, looking at her, their expressions curious rather than menacing, as if they were trying to decide something. She wrote that on March 15th, she'd found them in the cellar in the corner where Robert had kept his tools, and they were eating something. When she lit a lamp to see what it was, they'd hidden it quickly, but not before she'd seen. It was meat, raw and bloody, and it hadn't come from any pig or cow. The color was wrong, the texture was wrong, and when she forced them to show her where they'd gotten it, they'd led her outside to the place where she'd buried Robert under the snow. The snow had melted enough to expose his body, but it wasn't whole anymore. Parts of him were missing. His left arm was gone from the elbow down. Part of his thigh had been carved away. The cuts were crude, but purposeful, made with the same kitchen knife. The twins had been holding over her bed the night before. Margaret's journal entry for that day dissolved into incoherent scrawling. The words, "My babies, my babies, my babies," repeated over and over until the page ran out. But even that wasn't the whole truth. Even that wasn't the worst of it, because when Margaret had confronted the twins, when she'd screamed at them and demanded to know how they could do such a thing, they'd simply looked at each other and smiled their identical smiles. And then one of them, Clara, or Carolyn, had spoken in that strange old voice that didn't belong to a child. "He was already dead, Mother. He wasn't using it anymore, and we were so hungry. You don't understand how hungry we were, how hungry we've always been, always," Margaret had whispered, horror dawning. "Oh yes," the other twin said, "since before we were born, since we were growing inside you, sharing that small space, fighting for every bit of nourishment. Do you know what it's like to be hungry from before you can even remember? To know hunger as your first and only truth." The twins had stepped closer, moving in perfect synchronization, and Margaret had backed away until she hit the wall. "We tried to be good," they said together, their voices overlapping eerily. "We tried to eat what you gave us and be satisfied, but it was never enough. It's never been enough. And now Father's gone, and the food's gone, and there's only you left, Mother. Only you." Margaret ran. She ran from the cellar through the house, tried to get out the front door, but they'd barred it somehow, impossibly strong for their small size. She ran to her room and barricaded herself inside, and spent the night listening to them moving around the house, whispering, scraping at her door, occasionally calling to her in sweet, reasonable voices. "We don't want to hurt you, Mother. We just need you to understand, we're special. We've always been special. Even you must have known that. The way we came out, remember? The way we were tangled together. How the midwife said she'd never seen anything like it. How she said we'd shared everything in the womb, even our blood. We're not like other people, Mother. We need more. We need different all night. They talked to her through the door, explaining, justifying, cajoling. They told her about the hunger that had defined their entire existence, a hunger that normal food only temporarily masked. They told her about the dreams they shared, twin dreams of meat and bone and the secret salt of human flesh. They told her about the whispering, which had always been plans, schemes, ways to satisfy the hunger without being caught. They told her they'd been waiting for winter, waiting for isolation, waiting for an opportunity. They told her that they'd been glad when Father died because they knew, somehow they knew with an instinct older than thought, that dead flesh could sustain them in ways that animal flesh never could. And they told her in voices full of childish hurt that they didn't understand why she was so upset. They were just trying to survive. Wasn't that what she'd always taught them? To be strong, to endure, to do what was necessary. When dawn came on March 16th, the house was silent. Margaret, exhausted and half mad with terror and grief, couldn't hear the twins anywhere. She waited until noon, until she was certain they must be asleep, and then she carefully, quietly moved her barricade and opened her door. The house was empty. The twins were gone. Their coats and boots, which had mysteriously disappeared, were back, laid out neatly on the kitchen table. Next to them was a note in their precise, identical handwriting. "We've gone to find more food. We'll be back tonight. Wait for us, Mother. We have so much to talk about." Margaret knew she had only hours. She searched frantically and found her own coat and boots hidden in the cellar, buried under a pile of potatoes. She dressed in layers, took what little food remained, and prepared to run. But before she left, she went to the twins' room one final time. She needed to understand. She needed to find some evidence that her daughters were still human, still salvageable, still her babies despite everything. What she found instead was a collection of small bones cleaned and sorted by type, arranged in careful patterns on a shelf they'd hidden behind a loose board. Bird bones, mouse bones, rabbit bones, and one set that looked disturbingly like small human finger bones. Though Margaret told herself desperately that they had to be something else, had to be. Next to the bones was a small book, more a notebook really, filled with the twins' handwriting. It was a catalog of tastes, of textures, of what they'd eaten, and when, and how it had made them feel. The entries went back years to when they were 6, 7 years old. Small animals at first, then larger ones. The later entries included detailed descriptions of Robert's flesh, which parts were best, which methods of preparation they preferred. The final entry, dated March 15th, said simply, "Mother will taste the best. We can feel it, but we'll wait, we'll be patient, we'll make it last." Margaret had stood there reading those words, and something broke inside her. Some essential connection between the things she'd been and the things she would become. She went back to the cellar, to where Robert's body lay, and she looked at what her daughters had done. Then she took the knife they'd used. The kitchen knife she'd given one of them for her 10th birthday to help with cooking. This is the part Margaret never fully explained to the constable, the part that had to be inferred from evidence and the rambling, dissociated confession she gave. But what seems to have happened is this. Margaret spent the afternoon of March 16th preparing. She took the knife, and she took a saw from Robert's tools, and she went back to the twins' room, and she read their terrible diary again. And she made a decision that no mother should ever have to make. When the twins returned that evening, they found the house dark and cold. The fire had gone out. Their mother wasn't in the kitchen or her room. They called for her, their voices echoing through the empty house. They found her in the cellar, sitting in the dark, waiting. Next to her was the wicker basket, and in that basket was something wrapped in cloth. The twins came down the stairs together, hand in hand, curious and unafraid. "Mother," they said in unison, "what are you doing down here? Why did you let the fire go out? It's cold." Margaret stood up slowly, and in the dim light from the cellar windows, The twins could see that she'd been crying. Her face was wet, her eyes swollen, but her jaw was set with a terrible determination. "I know what you are now," she said quietly. "I know what you've always been, and I can't let you leave this house. I can't let you go into the world. You'd hurt people. You'd kill them. My babies, my little girls. You'd kill them." The twins looked at each other, that wordless communication passing between them, and when they looked back at Margaret, they were smiling. Not their usual smiles, but something sharp and predatory. "You can't stop us, Mother," they said together. "We're stronger than you think, and we're so hungry. We've been hungry all day looking for food, and there's nothing out there. Nothing but frozen ground and dead trees. So we came home, because we knew you'd still be here. We knew you'd wait for us. You always do." They started walking toward her, still holding hands, still moving in that eerie synchronization. Margaret held up the knife, her hand shaking. "Don't," she begged. "Please don't make me. You're my daughters. I love you. I've always loved you." "We know," the twins said, and now they were close enough that Margaret could see their eyes reflecting what little light there was. "That's why you'll taste so good." What happened next, Margaret could never fully describe. She remembered the twins rushing at her faster than children should be able to move. She remembered the knife in her hand, remembered defending herself, remembered the feel of blade meeting flesh. She remembered screaming, remembered them screaming, remembered the hot splash of blood and the sound of something breaking. Bone or spirit or both. She remembered they fought her together, as they did everything together. 2 sets of hands clawing at her, 2 sets of teeth trying to bite, 2 voices shrieking in rage and pain and hunger. And she remembered that even when she'd hurt them, even when she'd cut them and they'd bled, they didn't separate. They clung to each other, and when one fell, the other fell with her, and when it was finally over, when the cellar was silent, except for Margaret's sobbing, they were still holding hands. Margaret sat in that cellar for hours, maybe days she couldn't later recall. When she finally emerged, she did so with purpose. She knew what she had to do. She knew what would be believed and what wouldn't. She knew she couldn't tell the truth, the whole truth, about what her daughters had become. No one would believe her. They'd call her mad. They'd say she'd killed her children in a fit of winter madness, cabin fever, starvation-induced psychosis. They'd hang her probably, and that would be a mercy. But some part of Margaret, the part that was still a mother, wanted something preserved, some evidence, some testament that her daughters had existed, that they'd been real, even if they'd been monstrous. So she went back down to the cellar, and she did the thing that would haunt her forever. She took the saw and she cut off their fingers, all 10 from each girl. 20 small fingers that had held each other so constantly, so insistently. She preserved them in honey, wrapped them in the baptism gowns the twins had worn as infants, placed them carefully in the wicker basket. Evidence, proof, a confession without words. Then she walked to town, 3 miles through mud and melting snow, carrying that basket, and she turned herself in. But that was the story she told the constable, that she'd killed her daughters in self-defense after they'd attacked her, driven mad by hunger and isolation. She showed him Robert's body, or what remained of it. She showed him the bones in the twins' room, the diary, the evidence of what they'd been. The constable, a man named William Porter, who'd lived in Harwick all his life and thought he'd seen everything, stood in that house and tried to make sense of it. He documented everything meticulously because that was his job, even though every instinct told him to burn the place to the ground and forget he'd ever been there. The investigation lasted 3 months. Medical examiners came from Burlington. They examined Robert's body, what was left of it. They examined the twins' remains in the cellar. They read the diary. They interviewed Margaret, who told them everything except the final truth. The real reason she'd mutilated her daughters' bodies, taking their fingers as some kind of penance, or memorial or proof that they'd been real. She never mentioned the twin speed, their strength, the ancient wrongness in their voices. She let them think it was madness, grief, a mother's broken mind. In the end, no charges were filed. The official conclusion was that the Whitmore twins, Clara and Caroline, had suffered from a shared psychotic condition brought on by extreme isolation and starvation, and that they'd committed acts of cannibalism before their mother, in fear for her life, had killed them in self-defense. Robert Whitmore's death was ruled accidental, exposure during a blizzard, though the post-mortem mutilation of his body was noted with clinical distaste. Margaret Whitmore was declared mentally unfit to stand trial and was committed to the Vermont State Hospital for the Insane, where she died 6 months later from pneumonia. The farmhouse was abandoned. No one would buy it. No one would live there. It stood empty for 30 years until it burned down in 1922, 'cause a fire unknown, and by then, everyone who'd known the real story was dead, or had moved away, or had convinced themselves they'd heard the tale wrong. The county records exist, dusty and forgotten in a basement archive. The newspaper reports were sensational for a few weeks, and then forgotten. The story became a ghost story, became legend, became something people didn't quite believe had really happened. But in those official records, if you look carefully, there are details that don't quite fit the official narrative. The constable's notes mention that when he examined the twins' bodies, they'd been partially consumed, not by animals. The cuts were too precise, too purposeful. Margaret had no blood on her clothes except the twins, and it was fresh from the killing. But in the cellar, in the corner where she'd sat waiting for them, there was a plate, and on that plate were bones that had been cooked and eaten. The medical examiner noted this, but couldn't explain it, or wouldn't,